The wind didn't just blow in the Frostclaw territories, it bit, searching for skin like a predator that had been promised to kill. I stood on the edge of Platform 9, the iron depot groaning under the weight of 1,000 tons of steam and ice, feeling exactly like the ghost everyone said I was. To my pack, I was Mira Hale, the scentless mistake, an Omega whose own wolf was so silent she might as well have been human. But today, I wasn't just a ghost, I was a commodity. My stepfather had finally found a use for the daughter he despised, trading me like a piece of livestock to settle a debt with Cain Wolfsbane, a man whose reputation for cruelty was the only thing colder than the winter outside. The Aurora Express hissed, a wall of white vapor obscuring the guards already fanning out with silver shackles meant for my wrists. My heart hammered against my ribs, the only sound in a world that refused to hear me. In a desperate surge of panic, I lunged for the first door that wasn't guarded, a sleek, silver-trimmed carriage that looked like a sanctuary. I didn't see the royal crest on the glass until the lock clicked behind me, sealing me in a room that smelled of frozen pine and old power. Across from me sat a man whose eyes held the stillness of a glacier, Lucien Frost, the Alpha King, a man so lethal he was feared by the very monsters I was running from. I had walked into the wrong carriage, and in doing so, I'd just handed my life to the most dangerous wolf in existence. Narrating and crafting these 45-minute journeys takes our team over 60 hours of dedicated writing and editing every single week. If you've ever felt like an outsider, invisible in your own world, please consider following our journey. It's a small gesture from you, but it's the only way we can keep bringing Mira's world to life for you. The wind in the Frostclaw territories didn't just blow, it hunted. It searched for any exposed skin with the clinical precision of a predator, and tonight, I was the only prey left on the platform. I stood in the shadow of a rusted water tower, my fingers curled tightly around the small, tarnished locket that was the only proof I had ever been loved. Still trying to hide, ghost? The voice was like jagged glass. I didn't have to turn to know it was Silas, my stepbrother. He stood several feet away, draped in heavy furs that my biological father had once owned. Beside him, my stepsister Alara smirked, her nostrils flaring as she deliberately inhaled the freezing air. "I don't even know why you bother," she mocked, stepping into my personal space. "I could be standing an inch away from you with my eyes closed, and I still wouldn't know you existed. You're a biological void, Mira. No scent. No spark. No wonder the Baron finally found a way to make you useful." I flinched, not from her words, I'd heard them for 21 years, but from the truth behind them. In a world where a wolf's scent was their identity, their status, and their soul, I was a ghost Omega. To the Frostclaw pack, I was a defect. A glitch in the lineage. "The carriage is at the end of the line, Silas," a gravelly voice interrupted. I looked past them and felt my blood turn to ice. It was my stepfather, the Baron. He wasn't looking at me like a daughter or even a servant. He was looking at me like a man checking the ledgers of a failing business. Behind him stood two men in the dark, blood-red livery of Cain Wolfsbane. They carried silver-plated shackles that glimmered under the depot's flickering gaslights. "The debt is settled, then?" Silas asked, his voice laced with cruel excitement. "To the last coin," the Baron replied. He finally met my eyes, his expression utterly vacant. "Cain has a penchant for the rare, Mira. A wolf with no scent is a curiosity he's willing to pay handsomely for. You should be proud. It's the first time you've ever brought this family any value." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't being sent away for a better life. I was being sold as a literal object, a curiosity to be caged by a man whose sadistic tendencies were whispered about in every tavern from here to the gray zones. "No," I whispered, the word lost in the roar of the approaching train. "Don't be dramatic," Alara hissed, reaching out to grab my arm. "You're doing us all a favor." As her hand closed on my wrist, a primal instinct I didn't know I possessed flared to life. I didn't shift, I couldn't, but a sudden, sharp vibrations seemed to ripple through my skin. It caught her off guard, her grip slipping just enough for me to wrench my arm free. I didn't think. I ran. "Grab her," the Baron bellowed. I bolted into the labyrinth of the depot, my boots skidding on the frost-slicked cobblestones. Behind me, the heavy thud of boots and the clinking of silver chains echoed against the brick walls. The Aurora Express was pulling in, a massive mountain of black iron and screaming pistons. Steam erupted from the undercarriage in great, blinding clouds, turning the world into a gray purgatory. I dove between moving luggage carts, my lungs burning as I inhaled the acrid scent of coal smoke. The Wolfsbane guards were fast, their predatory lunges narrowing the gap between us. I could hear the snarling of their inner wolves, a sound that usually made me freeze in terror. But tonight, the fear of the cage was stronger than the fear of the hunt. I reached the elite section of the platform, where the carriages were made of reinforced steel and polished mahogany. The guards were closing in, their shadows stretching long across the frost. I saw a sleek, silver-trimmed carriage sitting slightly apart from the others. It bore the crown and fong emblem of the High Moon royalty, a car that was strictly off-limits to anyone below a high alpha rank. The door was ajar, a freak occurrence likely caused by the sudden drop in pressure from the mountain wind. I didn't hesitate. I vaulted onto the brass steps and threw myself inside, slamming the heavy door behind me. The deadbolt engaged with a heavy, pressurized hiss that signaled the carriage was now vacuum-sealed. I collapsed against the door, my chest heaving, listening to the muffled shouts of the guards outside. They hammered on the reinforced glass, but they didn't dare try to force the lock. Even they knew that to breach a royal carriage was an act of treason punishable by death. I stayed there for a long time, let out a shaky breath, and waited for my heart to stop trying to hammer its way out of my chest. The interior of the carriage was silent, save for the rhythmic, low thrum of the engine. It was dim, lit only by the faint amber glow of floor-level lamps. The air smelled of frozen pine, old parchment, and a scent so intoxicating it made my head spin, wood smoke and ancient ice. Slowly, I turned around. The carriage was larger than I expected, furnished with deep leather chairs and a sprawling desk carved from dark obsidian. At the far end, sitting in a high-backed chair that looked more like a throne, was a man. He didn't move. He didn't even seem to be breathing. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than my stepfather's entire estate, but it couldn't hide the raw, lethal power of the body beneath it. His hair was the color of midnight, and his skin was unnaturally pale. But it was his eyes that stopped my breath. They were shards of glacier glass, cold and brilliant, and they were fixed directly on me. This was Lucien Frost, the Alpha King, the ice-blood monster of the north. The silence in the room was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against my lungs. I expected him to roar, to shift, to throw me from the moving train. Instead, he simply watched me, his expression unreadable, a predator who had just found a strange, scentless bird in his sanctuary. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. I was the center of a king's terrifying attention. Creating these immersive 45-minute cinematic experiences takes our team over 60 hours of writing and editing per week. If you've ever felt like an outsider like Mira, please consider subscribing. It's a small click for you, but it's the only way we can keep telling these stories for you. The silence in the carriage was not an absence of sound. It was a presence. It felt like the weight of a mountain pressing against my eardrums, or the static in the air just before a lightning strike. Lucien Frost did not speak. He did not ask how I had breached his security or why a girl in tattered clothes was shivering on his hand-woven rug. He simply sat there, his chin resting on a knuckle, watching me with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying insect. An hour passed. Then two. The only sound was the rhythmic, metallic heartbeat of the Aurora Express as it began its steep ascent into the Iron Mountains. I stood by the door, my legs aching, refusing to sit in the velvet chairs that cost more than my life. He was waiting for me to snap. He was waiting for the begging, the weeping, or the frantic apologies that usually filled his days. But he didn't realize that I had been trained for this. I had been a ghost for 21 years. I knew how to exist in the silence of others. "You're taller than you look on the coins," I finally said, my voice cracking the stillness like a stone through ice. Lucien's eyes narrowed, a flash of something: amusement? Irritation? Flickering in the depths of that glacier blue. He still didn't speak. He simply adjusted his posture, the movement fluid and dangerous. "Are you going to keep staring, or are you going to kill me?" I asked, stepping forward into the amber light. "Because if it's the latter, I'd appreciate it if you did it before we reach the next station. I have a very busy schedule of being sold into slavery that I'd like to avoid." Finally, the king moved. He leaned back, his eyes tracking the way I didn't flinch when he stood. He was a pillar of cold, a man carved from the very permafrost he ruled. "Most wolves lose control of their bladders before I even look at them," he said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in my marrow. "You have no scent, no rank, and currently no future. Why aren't you afraid?" "I've spent my life being invisible, Your Majesty," I replied, meeting his gaze. "It's hard to fear a monster when you've already been raised by them. At least you're honest about what you are." As the train climbed higher, the temperature inside the carriage began to plummet. It wasn't the external cold of the mountains, it was coming from him. I watched as frost began to spiderweb across the obsidian dusk. Thin needles of ice crystallized on the velvet curtains. Lucien's breathing became labored, a ragged hiss through his teeth. His skin, already pale, took on a translucent, bluish tint. This was the ice blood reality, the curse of the Frostclaw Alphas. His power was so vast that it was literally freezing him from the inside out. He gripped the edges of his chair, his knuckles white, his jaw locked in an expression of suppressed agony. I didn't think about the protocol. I didn't think about the fact that touching a king was a capital offense. I grabbed a heavy, fur-lined throw from the sofa and stepped toward him. "Stay back," he gasped, a cloud of frozen mist erupting from his lips. "The air around me, it will stop your heart." "My heart has been cold for a long time," I said, draped the blanket over his broad shoulders. I didn't recoil when my fingers brushed the back of his neck and felt the skin-searing cold of his flesh. Instead, I tucked the fur around him, my hands steady. The deep vibration in my blood, that silent frequency I'd always thought was a defect, began to hum. It was a low, soothing thrum that seemed to pulse in time with the train's engine. Lucien's eyes flew open. The jagged edges of his aura softened. The frost on the desk stopped spreading. For a moment, the king looked less like a god and more like a man who had finally been allowed to take a breath. "Who are you?" he whispered, the ice in his voice replaced by a raw, naked confusion. "I told you." "I'm a ghost," I said, sliding onto the floor across from his chair, keeping my back against the wall. "But since we're trapped here for the next 3 days, and since you're likely going to have me executed the moment we reach the summit, why don't we make a pact?" He pulled the furs tighter, the shivering of his massive frame slowly subsiding. "What kind of pact?" "Brutal honesty," I said. "No titles. No masks. We're just two outcasts on a train to nowhere. Tell me the truth of the king, and I'll tell you the truth of the ghost. After all, dead men tell no tales, and I'll be dead soon enough." Lucien looked at me for a long time, the silence returning, but this time it was different. It was an invitation. "I have 10,000 wolves who would die for me," he said quietly, staring into the dim amber light. "And not one who can stand within 5 feet of me without a coat. My father called this power a gift. He lied. It is a fortress. I am the king of loneliness, Mira Hale. I sit on a throne of ice and wait for the day I finally turn to stone." "At least people see your throne," I countered. "Do you know what it's like to scream in a crowded room and have no one turn their head? To have your own mother look at you and see a blank space?" My pack didn't just ignore me, they erased me. They told me I had no scent because I had no soul. I grew up believing I was a mistake of nature, a wolf that forgot how to howl. We talked through the night as the Aurora Express cut through the heart of the mountains. He told me of the political vultures waiting for him to succumb to the ice madness so they could carve up the north. I told him of the Baron's gambling debts and the silver shackles of Wolfsbane. The more we spoke, the more the air in the carriage seemed to warm, the deep vibration in my chest acting as a silent hearth for his frozen heart. On the second afternoon, the heavy thud of footsteps in the corridor jolted us out of a rare, comfortable silence. "Your Majesty?" The voice was sharp, oily, and authoritative. "Chancellor Thorn." Lucien's expression transformed instantly. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the mask of the Alpha King, cold, distant, and lethal. "Hide," he hissed, pointing toward the massive obsidian desk. I didn't hesitate. I slid into the knee-hole of the desk, pulling my skirts tight. The space was cramped, smelling of cedar and Lucien's pine-scented ink. A heartbeat later, the carriage door hissed open. "Chancellor," Lucien said, his voice a bored, dangerous drawl. "I believe I gave orders not to be disturbed until we reached the high pass." "My apologies, sire," Thorn replied, his footsteps clicking on the hardwood floor. He stopped just inches from the desk. I could see his polished black boots through the gap. "But there has been a security breach." "A stowaway. One of the Baron's Omegas, the scentless one. We believe she may have been planted by the rebels to gain access to your person." "A scentless Omega?" Lucien let out a short, mocking laugh. "You think I wouldn't notice a living creature in my presence, Thorn? My blood would have frozen her solid before she crossed the threshold." "Of course, sire. But Wolfsbane is quite insistent. He claims she is his property, stolen from the depot. He's demanded a full sweep of the train." I held my breath, my heart drumming against my ribs. Thorn leaned forward, his hand resting on the edge of the obsidian desk right above my head. I could feel the malice radiating off him, a sharp, acidic scent that made my stomach turn. "If Wolfsbane wants to search my personal carriage," Lucien said, his voice dropping to a whisper that promised death, "tell him to bring his army and meet me on the tracks. Until then, tell him to stay in the passenger cars with the rest of the hounds." "Am I clear?" "Perfectly, Your Majesty." Thorn's boots turned. He lingered for a second too long at the door. "It's a pity, though. I hear the girl is quite a curiosity. A wolf with no scent. Imagine the things one could do to a creature that the world can't even prove exists." The door hissed shut. I waited for a count of 10 before crawling out. My hands were shaking. Lucien was standing at the window, his back to me, his hands clenched so hard the veins were bulging. "He knows," I whispered. "He suspects," Lucien corrected, turning to look at me. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were burning with a dark, protective fire. "But he's wrong about one thing." "What's that?" "You aren't a curiosity, Mira. And you aren't scentless." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, but no longer freezing. "I can hear you. Every vibration of your soul. It's the only thing in this world that isn't white noise." The transition from the lowlands to the Iron Peaks was marked by a shift in the engine's rhythm, a deep, tectonic roar as the Aurora Express fought the gravity of the world's most treacherous pass. Inside the carriage, the air remained charged with the secrets we had traded through the night, but nature had its own truth to tell. It started with a sound that wasn't a sound, a sub-bass frequency that made the crystal decanters on the obsidian desk hum. Then came the crack. It was a thunderous, sky-splitting snap of shifting tectonic plates. "Brace yourself." Lucien lunged for me, but the world tilted before he could reach my hand. The impact was cataclysmic. A wall of snow and ancient rock slammed into the side of the train, the force shearing the metal like paper. The carriage lurched, the wheels screaming as they were forced off the tracks. We weren't just derailed, we were hanging. I watched, paralyzed, as the window revealed a sickening view. The front half of the carriage was suspended over a 3,000-foot drop, held in place only by the sheer weight of the rear engine and the twisted couplings of the car behind us. The heating system died with a final, choked hiss. Darkness claimed the room, lit only by the violent, flickering sparks of severed electrical lines. And then, the true terror began. Lucien collapsed to his knees, his hands clutching his head. The physical shock of the crash had shattered his mental iron walls. Without his focus, the ice blood was no longer a contained power, it was an elemental storm. "Mira, get out." He wheezed, his voice sounding like cracking glaciers. I can't hold it back." The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted into a realm where life wasn't meant to exist. I watched in horror as the air itself seemed to crystallize into jagged shards. The walls of the carriage groaned as they were coated in inches of thick, blue ice. My breath froze in my throat, the very moisture in my lungs turning to needles. Lucien was at the center of the vortex. His wolf was surfacing, but it wasn't a transformation of flesh and bone, it was an eruption of pure, lethal frost. His eyes had turned entirely white, and the skin on his arms was splitting, revealing a glowing, frozen light beneath. He was going to explode. The ice madness was claiming him, and it would shatter this carriage into a million fragments, sending us both into the abyss below. I ignored the instinct to run. I ignored the frostbite blooming across my skin. I crawled across the canted, ice-slicked floor, my fingers numbing until I couldn't feel the wood beneath me. "Lucien, look at me," he roared, a sound of absolute, agonizing isolation. I reached through the swirl of freezing mist and slammed my palms against his chest, right over his heart. The contact was like touching a sun made of dry ice. It should have killed me. It should have frozen my blood in a single heartbeat. But the moment I touched him, the deep vibration I had carried like a curse my entire life finally found its purpose. It wasn't a silent frequency, it was a counter-resonance. A golden, tectonic hum erupted from my marrow. It met the jagged, chaotic spikes of his ice and smoothed them out. I felt his heart beneath my palms, a frantic, terrified bird, and I forced my own steady rhythm into him. "Stay. Be still. I am here." The effect was instantaneous. The blue ice on the walls stopped growing. The jagged shards in the air dissolved into soft snow. Lucien's breathing hitched, then slowed, his forehead falling against my shoulder as the white glow in his eyes faded back to glacier blue. We sat there in the wreckage, the carriage groaning as it swung over the precipice, wrapped in a warmth that shouldn't have been possible in the heart of a blizzard. Lucien pulled back, his hands trembling as he cupped my face. He didn't look at me like a king anymore. He looked at me like a man who had just seen a miracle. "You're not an Omega," he whispered, his voice thick with realization. "The reason they couldn't smell you, the reason you felt like a void, it's because your soul doesn't project. It absorbs." He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. "You aren't a ghost, Mira. You're an anchor. In 1,000 years, there has never been a wolf like you. You were born to hold the storm." The weight of his words was heavier than the snow outside. My entire life, I had been told I was a mistake. But in the ruins of a train, the most powerful man in the North was telling me I was the only thing that could save him. The carriage shifted, a metal coupling snapping with a sharp ping. We were sliding further toward the edge. "We have to move," Lucien said, his alpha command returning. "The rear coupling won't hold much longer." He began to search the wreckage for anything we could use to climb out. As he threw aside a shattered mahogany panel, a heavy, iron-bound trunk from the luggage compartment burst open, its contents spilling across the floor. Amidst the silks and silver was a leather satchel marked with the seal of my stepfather's estate. I reached for it, my brow furrowing. This was in the Baron's private cargo. The latch had been broken in the crash. Inside weren't gambling ledgers or gold. There were letters. Dozens of them, tied with a ribbon I recognized. It was a scrap of my mother's favorite dress. My breath hitched as I pulled out the top parchment. It was a report from a private investigator, dated 12 years ago. "The deed is done." The brakes on the elder Hale's carriage were cut as instructed. The accident will be blamed on the mountain fog. With the true alpha dead and the scentless girl under your protection, the Hale lands are yours to consolidate. The world went stiller than the ice outside. I read the next one and the next. They were intercepted letters from my biological father's allies, all detailing the Baron's slow, methodical plan to erase my father and suppress my wolf. The Baron hadn't just neglected me. He had murdered my father. He had spent a decade gaslighting me, telling me I was a defect so that I would never realize my power, the power to anchor a king. He had kept me weak so he could stay rich. Mira? Lucien was at my side, his eyes scanning the letters. I didn't cry. The time for tears had ended back at the depot. A new feeling was rising in me, something hotter than the deep vibration, something that burned through the cold of the Iron Peaks. It was a cold, calculated rage. He told me I was nothing, I said, my voice as sharp as the ice Lucien once commanded. He told me my father died because he was too weak to protect us. I looked up at the king, the letters clutched in my hand. My family didn't trade me to settle a debt, Lucien. They traded me because they were afraid I would find these. They wanted me in Cane Wolfsbane's cages, so I would never find my way back to them. Lucien took the letters from my hand, his aura flaring once more, not in a storm, but in a focused, lethal pressure. They wanted a ghost, Lucien said, reaching out to pull me to my feet as the carriage gave a final, sickening lurch. But when we reach the high pass, they're going to find a queen. And I'm going to help you burn their legacy to the ground. With a final roar of metal, the coupling snapped. Lucien grabbed me, his arm like an iron band around my waist, and leapt through the shattered window just as the obsidian carriage vanished into the white void of the abyss. The high-pass bridge was a marvel of architectural arrogance, a span of black stone and reinforced steel that connected the wild Iron Peaks to the civilized heart of the north. As the battered remains of the Aurora Express limped onto the platform, the air was thick with more than just mountain mist. It was thick with the scent of 1,000 wolves, all gathered for the centennial summit, their eyes fixed on the smoke-shard engine that had survived the impossible. Waiting at the center of the platform was a wall of silver-clad soldiers, the private guard of Cane Wolfsbane. At their head stood Cane himself, his face a mask of predatory entitlement, flanked by my stepfather, the Baron. They didn't look like men who had just seen a train survive an avalanche. They looked like creditors coming to collect a debt. The train groaned to a halt, the screech of metal on metal sounding like a death knell. Before the steam had even cleared, Cane's voice boomed across the bridge, amplified by the natural acoustics of the stone. Lucien Frost. By the laws of the Council and the rights of the Blood Debt, I demand you release the Hale girl. She is a thief, a stowaway, and legally the property of the Wolfsbane pack. Hand over the scentless trash, and we will consider the sanctity of your carriage unviolated. The Baron stepped forward, his voice oily and loud for the benefit of the gathered dignitaries. As her legal guardian, I apologize for the disgrace my stepdaughter has brought upon the crown. She is a defect, sire, unstable and scentless. Let us take her back to the sump where she belongs, so the summit may begin without the stain of an Omega's trespass. The injustice of it felt like a physical weight. After everything, the murder of my father, the decade of being erased, the avalanche, they still spoke of me as if I were a broken tool. I looked at the letters in my hand, then at Lucien. He stood by the door, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his aura a low, vibrating hum of suppressed thunder. They want their property, Lucien, I whispered. They want a ghost, Lucien replied, his voice a low, lethal promise. But I'm going to give them a revolution. Lucien didn't just open the door. He kicked the release lever, and the heavy steel panel slid back with a thunderous boom that silenced the crowd. He stepped out onto the brass platform, his presence so overwhelming that the front line of Wolfsbane's guards instinctively took a step back, their instincts screaming at them to submit. Cane Wolfsbane, Lucien's voice didn't need amplification. It was the voice of the mountain itself. You speak of property. You speak of defects. You stand on my bridge, in my territory, and demand I hand over a passenger under my personal protection. The law is clear, Lucien. Kane snarled, his eyes flashing a sickly yellow. She has no rank. She is an Omega. She belongs to the one who holds her debt. Lucien looked down at me, extending a hand. I took it, stepping out from the shadows of the carriage. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of wolves on the platform. I was bruised, my navy dress was torn, and I had no scent, but I stood tall, my hand locked in that of the Alpha King. You are right about one thing, Kane, Lucien said, his gaze sweeping over the council. The law is clear. And the highest law of our kind is the law of the anchor. He turned to me, his glacier blue eyes burning with a heat I had never seen. Without a word, he pulled a small silver dagger from his belt. He didn't point it at the enemy. He pressed the blade into his own wrist. The crowd went silent. To see an Alpha King shed his own blood was a rarity that bordered on the sacred. As the dark, crimson life force pooled in his palm, Lucien took my hand and pressed his wrist against the ghost mark on my shoulder, the place where Kane's shackles would have gone. I, Lucien Frost, Alpha of the Frostlaw Pack, King of the Northern Territories, recognized the soul that was hidden. I recognized the anchor that held the storm. Mira Hale is not an Omega. She is my fated match. My blood mark is hers, and her vibration is mine. The resonance hit me like a tidal wave. For the first time in my life, I felt a connection that wasn't a void. I felt his strength, his ice, his loneliness, and I felt it all turn to warmth as it met my soul. You lie, the Baron screamed, his face turning a mottled purple. She is a defect. She has no wolf. She has more wolf than you have man, Baron, I said, my voice carrying across the platform, steady and cold. I held up the bundle of letters, the paper fluttering in the mountain wind. And she has the proof that her guardian is a murderer who cut the brakes on the Hale carriage 12 years ago to steal a title that was never his. The silence that followed was absolute. I tossed the letters onto the tracks at the council's feet. Kane Wolfsbane, seeing his political leverage dissolving, roared in fury. He began to shift, his body twisting and elongating into a massive, mangy brown wolf. He lunged for the carriage steps, a blur of fur and fangs. Lucien didn't even shift. He simply exhaled. A wall of pure, absolute zero ice erupted from the platform, freezing Kane midair. The rival Alpha slammed into the frozen barrier, trapped in a cage of crystal that sapped the heat from his body in seconds. Lucien stepped down the stairs, each footfall cracking the stone beneath him. He grabbed the Baron by the throat, hoisting the man into the air with a single hand. You spent 20 years trying to erase her, Lucien whispered, the sound carrying to every ear on the bridge. You told the world she was nothing so you could steal her everything. Today, I strip you of the name Hale. I strip you of your lands, your rank, and your breath. Lucien didn't kill him. That would have been too merciful. He dropped the Baron into the snow at the feet of the council. Chancellor Thorne, Lucien panted, his power vibrating through the very bridge. See that these men are taken to the ice fields. They will work the sump mines they so loved for the rest of their short, miserable lives. And inform the territories, the summit is cancelled. We have a coronation to prepare for. He turned back to me, the ice walls melting into a soft mist. The Alpha King, the monster of the north, knelt on one knee before the scentless girl from the iron sump. He took my hand and pressed it to his heart. The ghost is gone, Mira, he whispered. You're the queen of the frost. I looked at the crowd, at the villains who were being dragged away in chains, and finally, at the man who had seen me when I was invisible. I didn't need a scent to know who I was anymore. The stone of the Hale estate no longer felt cold. As I walked through the grand foyer, the dust of a decade was being swept away by servants who now bowed with genuine reverence. The Baron's sigils had been torn down, replaced by the original Hale crest, a lone wolf beneath a crescent moon. I ran my hand over the dark mahogany banister, and for the first time, the house didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a homecoming. "The gardens are blooming, Mira," Lucien said, appearing in the doorway. He had shed his royal robes for a simple sweater, his glacier blue eyes soft as they followed my movement. "Even the frost lilies. They say they only bloom when the land feels its true alpha has returned." I turned to him, a small smile playing on my lips. "The land has a funny way of knowing the truth before we do." We walked out onto the high terrace overlooking the valley. The sun was beginning to dip behind the iron peaks, painting the sky in bruised purples and electric pinks. It was the same sky I had looked at every night as a child, wondering why I was born a ghost. I reached inward, searching for that deep vibration that had once been a silent hum. Now it was a roar. It was a symphony. I realized then that my wolf hadn't been missing. She had been waiting for a world quiet enough to hear her. I let go. The shift didn't hurt. It wasn't the bone-snapping agony the Baron had described to scare me. It was a release. A shimmer of light, like the aurora itself, rippled across my skin. When my paws hit the stone, I wasn't a small, timid omega. I was a creature of moonlight and silver, my fur reflecting the shifting colors of the northern sky. Lucien let out a breathy laugh, shifting beside me into the massive black wolf I had first seen on the train. We stood together, midnight and starlight, looking out over our kingdom. In the silence of my mind, I spoke to the memory of the woman who had repaired my cloak and whispered that I was strong. "I found it, Mother," I thought. The strength wasn't in the scent. It was in the resonance. The coronation held weeks later was not an act of political theater, but a vow of heat and ice. The great hall of the Frostclaw Palace was filled with the scent of pine and the warmth of 1,000 hearths. As Lucien placed the silver circlet upon my head, he leaned in, his breath warm against my ear, a heat that was now permanent, anchored by my presence. "You aren't cold anymore," I whispered as we stood before our people. "I haven't been cold since the moment you stepped into my carriage," he replied, taking my hand and raising it to the light. I looked out at the faces of the Frostclaw pack, wolves of every rank, every station. They weren't looking through me anymore. They were looking at a queen who had been forged in the shadows and tempered in the frost. I had boarded the wrong train to escape a cage, only to find a throne I was born to fill. The ghost was dead. The anchor had risen. And as the Aurora Express whistled in the distance, a long, low mournful sound echoing through the mountains, I knew that every wrong turn I had ever taken had been leading me exactly where I was meant to be. Mira found her voice because she dared to walk into the wrong room. Where will your next choice take you? Thanks for watching until the very end. It truly means the world to us.